Hello again everyone, and today I have another one of these neat new little Sigma lenses to present to you, the Sigma 35mm f2 DG-DN-C for contemporary. This is part of a new line that Sigma are introducing, which will be known as their I series lenses, and the idea is that they'll be a lot like their more expensive art lenses in terms of build quality and image quality, but smaller and with a modestly darker maximum aperture, and as you can see here, a very distinctive external design. In some ways, the build quality of this lens is even nicer than Sigma's art lenses. Well, we'll look at that a bit more in a minute. It'll be available for Sony E-mount cameras as well as L-mount cameras, and will cost about £550 in the UK, so I imagine that'll be about $600 or so in the US. I'd like to thank Sigma for letting me borrow an early copy of this lens for testing, although as usual this is a totally independent lens review. A bright aperture 35mm lens is a favourite piece of kit for photographers working with full frame or APS-C cameras. On full frame, it's a moderately wide angle, fitting a lot into your scene while still being able to draw some attention to your main subject. On APS-C, it's a lovely standard field of view, pulling you into the picture a little more tightly. An aperture as bright as f2 is still good enough for getting somewhat out of focus backgrounds in your images or for shooting in darker situations, while enabling the lens itself to be much smaller and lighter than a much bigger f1.4 or even f1.2 lens. Well, let's get stuck in and look at the lens's build quality first. It's difficult for me to convey to you just how beautiful this lens is to handle and how very high quality just about everything about it feels. It's really solid, very tightly assembled and very metallic, with a nice mixture of brushed metal and hairline processed finishing. It looks pretty different as well, with a very unique design aesthetic. What do you think of it? Around the rear lens mount there is a thin weather sealing gasket, and Sigma claim that the lens is designed to be dust and splash resistant. Then comes the aperture ring. It turns with lovely positive clicks, particularly if you turn it to auto mode, so you're not likely to accidentally change your aperture here. This time there's no option to make that aperture ring turn smoothly, it will only work with clicks. Then you get a manual focus ring, which turns extremely smoothly, and it works very responsively with the lens's focus motor. You can switch between auto and manual focus with a very positive arc-shaped focus switch toward the rear of the lens. Manually focusing the lens is precise and responsive, however we see a lot of focus breathing here, which might be a little troublesome for filmmakers. Let's take a look at the lens's autofocus then. It's reasonably quick, reasonably confident, accurate and silent in use. If you use a newer Sony camera than my old A7R II, then you might see an even quicker performance here. The lens comes with a standard lens cap that clips on, unsurprisingly, as you can see, but it does also come with something very unusual, a magnetic lens cap that attaches itself right onto the front. Sigma are really thinking out of the box here. A magnetic lens cap holder will be available separately, which you can attach to your camera bag or somewhere else about your person. That could be an interesting solution for some people. It also comes with a very high quality metallic lens hood. Its filter size is 58mm wide and it does not have image stabilization. Overall, this line of Sigma lenses possibly has some of the highest build quality of any autofocus lens I've yet tested. It feels a bit like a Zeiss lens from the highest point of their manufacturing in the 1960s, but with autofocus. Anyway, let's move on to image quality. I'll be testing it first on a full frame camera, my 42MP Sony A7R II. Straight from f2 we see great sharpness, but contrast is just good at this widest aperture. If we look over in the corners, the image has softened and gotten quite dark, even with the in-camera corrections turned on. However, a pretty decent amount of detail is still being captured here. Stop down to f2.8 for slightly more resolution in those corners, and back in the middle, contrast looks excellent now. At f4, the middle continues to look perfect, and those corners are very slightly sharper again, looking very good now. They continue to see minuscule improvements at f5.6 and f8. If you stop down to f16, the image becomes softer again, due to the effects of diffraction. So it's a very good performance on a full frame camera, although if you're using a very high resolution one, then you might want to stop down just a little if you want the very sharpest picture quality in the image corners. Now let's see about the image quality on an APS-C camera. I've mounted it here onto my 24 megapixel Sony a5100. Straight from f2, the lens displays impressive sharpness again in the middle of the image and just good contrast. The corners look a bit softer, like on full frame, but not badly so. f2.8 looks the same in the corners, but the middle looks absolutely razor sharp now, with excellent contrast. Stop down to f4 and the middle looks just as good, and the corners look slightly sharper than before now. f5.6 and f8 see further tiny improvements, bringing the image corners some really excellent image quality now. As you'd expect, stop down to f16 and those corners become a little softer again due to the effects of diffraction. So on an APS-C camera, it's another very good performance, although if you want your image corners to be as sharp as possible, you should stop down the aperture. Alright, let's see about vignetting and distortion on a full frame camera. They're not usually a problem on an APS-C camera, and your in-camera corrections will deal with these, but if you turn those corrections off or shoot in RAW, then we see some moderate barrel distortion and a very high level of vignetting at f2. If you stop down to f2.8, f4 and f5.6, then that vignetting is gradually pushed into the corners, although you'll always see a little bit, so turn on your camera's corrections. Now let's take a look at close-up image quality. The lens can focus down to 27 centimeters, pretty close really for shooting smaller subjects. At f2, you can see some resolution there, but some very heavy ghosting is kind of rubbing it away. Stop down to f2.8 though to see a lot more contrast, and f4 looks impressively sharp again, so if you are shooting close up, stop down a little. Let's see how this lens works against bright light. It's an average performance here. There's a fair bit of broad flaring to be seen, but the good news is that it's quite light and subtle, so not too intrusive. Now let's take a look at the lens's bokeh. With a maximum aperture of f2 and a reasonably wide angle, it won't be your first lens of choice for getting background separation in your pictures, although it is quite capable of subtly emphasizing your subject in that way. The quality of its bokeh gets a clean bill of health from me. Those autofocus backgrounds always look really smooth, even in more difficult situations. And finally, let's see about longitudinal chromatic aberration. At the brightest aperture of f2, it's fairly noticeable with this lens, showing blue and magenta colour fringing on contrasting edges. At f2.8, it's still there, but at f4 it's mostly gone, so just an average performance here. Well then, taking everything into account, I was pretty pleased with the new Sigma 35mm f2 lens. This 35mm option isn't quite as polished as the 65mm lens when it comes to image quality, but it's still a very good performer. In fact, it's capable of awesome sharpness and contrast, even on a very high resolution camera, particularly if you stop down its aperture just a little. You just have to keep those in-camera corrections turned on for best results. Its biggest weakness is certainly that very strong vignetting. However, the Fortress is further held up by some very smooth looking bokeh and attractive colours, and of course you get that wonderful build quality. The Sigma 35mm f2 DG/DN Contemporary is a somewhat expensive 35mm lens, but its high quality just about justifies the price tag, just about. So it does have to come recommended.